Hello my friends, Takuya here, and welcome back to another alternate history Hearts of Iron 4 video. God, I am desperate for content. As I already explained in the polls here, I'm needing to create as many things as I possibly can, so by all means, keep your suggestions in the comment section coming. I'm going to put those suggestions for alternate history into polls, which you ultimately get to vote on, despite my inability to spell at this point. We will probably need to do Polish alternate history here at some point. Anyway, as for the results of our first poll, by a very large margin, you all wondered, what if Austria-Hungary had industrialized to German levels before World War I? Oh my god, does that change a lot. For the purpose of explaining the story, we're going to be diving into Great War Redux, which is a very restrictive mod, but at the same time it has so many more scenarios and is arguably better balanced than what you have from other World War I mods. Naturally, of course, in this time, we're going to be launching ourselves into the fray as Austria-Hungary, which historically had a very, very bad time in World War I. In the whole region, arguably a much worse time that would come eventually after. With a strong and stable monarchy, yet is simultaneously heavily weakened by economic issues as well as internal divisions from Czech parliament, Galician poverty, and a multi-ethnic army as well as Hungarian divisions, which actually in this mod, Hungary is a separate entity showcasing the whole dual crown issue of Austria-Hungary. We are presented with a nation that as soon as we dive into this, you will just see how incredibly weak Austria-Hungary is in comparison to Germany. Despite the very large army that you can see in here, Austria-Hungary always played second fiddle to the German Empire over the course of World War I, and really, it played second fiddle to the German Empire pretty much for the 30-odd years prior to the events of World War I, because Austria was heavily beaten out by the Germans, specifically the Prussians, which would go on to unite the German peoples behind it in the 1870s, thus giving us the German Empire as we know it. After this loss of prestige, Austria would become part of the Alliance of the Three Emperors, where Austria, Germany, and the Russians basically agreed to mutually support one another because they were all autocratic regimes in comparison to the slightly more democratic institutions that you would see in the West with the UK, France, and the Kingdom of Italy. Though that alliance would ultimately fall apart, with the Russians and the Austrians getting in each other's way over control of the Balkans. Unfortunately for Austria, despite these ambitions down in the Balkan, it, as I said, was always going to be second fiddle to the Germans. By the year 1900, the Germans were the largest economy and military by far in the entirety of Europe. I mean, you can see that represented here with the fact that the Germans, who we're allied with, have 53 civilian factories at the start, 25 military factories, and 15 dockyards. A truly massive industry, which is arguably only compared to the UK in the scenario, which has a very similar count for civilian and military factories, though it is still beaten out by the Germans, though the UK has a larger dockyard base, because this is a time in which the United Kingdom, of course, still dominated the ocean, but a naval buildup, a arms race, was occurring between the Germans and the UK prior to this that is one of the actual driving factors behind World War I. The desire for the Germans to be able to free themselves of domination by the UK in the seas, to be able to get access to their own colonial overseas empire and maintain that. Ultimately, the superiority of the British Navy and the blockade would be one of the key deciding factors in the overall conflict. Austria, in comparison to all this, is, significantly weaker. Divided into many different ethnic regions, there is very little that united the Austro-Hungarians together except the crown that they were all subservient to. The really big issue was, even when you looked at things economically, Austria was backwards. Its industry were years behind the Germans, and simultaneously it was highly concentrated in a few specific areas that was great for, producing a lot of goods out of one set spot, but the loss or damage or any kind of delay in that one area would naturally lead to a lot of pain. As an example, in Austria-Hungary, the most developed, most industrialized, most powerful economic region, if you will, was not actually Austria proper. It was Bohemia. Bohemia was where the majority of arms produced in World War I for the Austrians came out of. And this kind of lopsided level of industry is something that really negatively impacted the Austro-Hungarians. There just was a drastic difference between the administrative Austrian-German population, the industrious Czechs, and then the largely agrarian, independent-minded Hungarians and Bosnians and Croatians and all the varying different groups. This lack of industry not only affected Austria negatively in the war, but is specifically one of the things that would help to divide the population in and of itself. So, what do we do about it? Well, here's the thing that we're going to have to do in order to create the scenario in the first place. Despite the scenario of the Austrians having equal industry to the Germans, like the sheer amount of things that we would have to change in the decades prior in order to make that possible would be insane. Like we straight up would have to annex parts of Germany, if you will. Like as an example, one of the key deciding factors for German expansion was the takeover of the Silesia region, which was extremely rich in coal and other resources that were necessary for industrialization in the first place. When Austria lost this to the Prussians, that was a massive blow to their ability to industrialize. For the sake of the scenario, we can't just give Silesia back to the Austrians because that is one of the key things that led to the rise of Germany in the first place. So we're gonna kind of have to assume that maybe through smarter investments, maybe investments by the German Empire, maybe due to greater cooperation with the Russians initially in previous decades, that the Austrians do have better industry in this time, but it cannot, by that scenario, be 100% equal, like equal parity with the Germans. So the Germans having 53 civilian factories and 25 military factories means that if we go to the Austrians, us here, with 10 civilian and military, the Hungarian, who are our vassals, if you will, combined with 6 and 3, that means that is 16 and 13. And then the Bosnian Herzegovina down here, which has 0, so that doesn't really matter. We can assume through smarter investment and developments that maybe Austria-Hungary is 60 or 70% the size of Germany. Not 100%. That is nowhere close. But that is still a massive, massive shift in this new time. Yes, Austria-Hungary is still weaker than Germany, which is one of the reasons why Germany is still willing to work with it and doesn't see Austria as a rival to its dominance. But a significantly stronger economy for the Austrians, more spread out industry throughout the region, this is something that is specifically going to help to unite varying different peoples behind the Austrian throne, which perhaps one of the things they did is that they invested more heavily into factories and industrial efforts in different regions, from Hungary to Poland to all the different groups, in order to not spread the wealth, that's the wrong term, but specifically invest in the peoples there in order to bind them closer to the Austrian heartlands. Simple things like light manufacturing occurring in other parts of the realm, but heavier manufacturing that requires the goods from the light manufacturing being in Austria proper, so that economically the regions were still tied, but all of them got a share of the industry. To that end, we're going to put on instant construction, even though I don't really like to do this here much in the first place. And of course, we're going to have to do focus.autocomplete because we are going to assume that much more of the Austrian industrial tree is already finished. So first off, industrial expansion, Czech steel, urbanization of Cisleithania. Galatia is going to have more investment placed into it. Hungary is going to have greater mining that takes place in it. We're going to say that these things occurred specifically after the loss of Silesia because the Austrians needed access to additional resources, so they were forced to invest in other regions to gain access to this. We can't do anything about Croatian industrialization or modernization of Slovakia. That's not really going to occur until we change things politically, but one needs to understand that by having these different industrial focuses already complete, not only does it strengthen the economy, but simultaneously it combines, or rather it binds, I should say, the varying different peoples of the empire closer together. So if we compare that to the Germans with 53 and 25, that means that we could probably raise our own military factory count to about, I'd say, 20. And then civilian factory-wise, if we're at 25, we can say it goes up to 35 or 40. We're not going to put it again to the complete level of the Germans because that wouldn't make sense at all. And simultaneously, the German Empire would see it as too much of a threat. So civilian factory-wise, we're going to go in here and we're going to industrialize the Austrian heartlands more. We're going to invest a little bit over here in Slovakia, a little bit down here in Bosnia, a little bit over here in Croatia, and then we're going to get some military factories. Again, the big thing about this is that we have to assume that by virtue of control, Austria has more arms development in Austria proper. Maybe some in Hungary, but not necessarily as much because the crown is still going to want to concentrate the majority of that heavy industry and military equipment in Austria so it can control it and use it to, well, build the army that is then used to control the rest of the empire. It wouldn't make sense to build up massive military stockpiles in regions that potentially could rebel against the crown. At the same time that we do that, we have to understand that in order for Austria to have a similar level of industry to the Germans, it's going to have more technology like what the Germans have. This then, my friends, is the last of what it is that we're doing before we start to build the scenario. Of course, things do rapidly change because since Austria is much more heavily industrialized in this time, because they had greater investments into minorities, this means that from 1910 to 1914, the modernization and centralization efforts that the Austrians would launch would be largely more effective because they wouldn't have to be focusing on industrializing to nearly the same degree in this time because it's already done. Thus, political focuses are able to be maintained at a much higher rate. As such, the first thing that we're going to do, maintain the Ausgleich. Since 1867, Austria and Hungary have represented a united entity. One of the greatest powers in the world, we must mobilize efforts in stabilizing the empire and avoid internal dissension. Naturally, of course, we can assume that although centralization efforts will be made with Austrian politics in the heartlands, primarily the big focus in the beginning is going to be on uniting the disparate peoples. Transylvanian politics. Hungary is the largest constituent in the empire, as well as the first territory in terms of demography. However, Stephen's crown is plagued by many minorities that it's time to integrate. At the same time that is happening, we can then say that the pig war, the economic war between Austria and Serbia and whatnot, that is something that is finished. This is something that is probably not even going to take place specifically because, well, the Austrian economy is significantly more powerful. Maybe. Relations are instead normalized. This is another fine point here, as I already talked about for the industry. Theoretically, in this time, even though concentrating industry is definitely better for producing a couple small goods, the big thing is we can say that industry is more dispersed in this time, as factories have been spread across the empire more. The idea being investing smaller amounts in more regions in order to be able to unite the different peoples. Naturally, the Austrians are still going to be plagued by different minority groups that are continuously going to try to destabilize things within. But theoretically, with greater industry, with greater economy, with greater everything, the state is going to have more resources to focus on police efforts in order to be able to stop these activists. Either way, the question of the, oh god, this is going to sound wrong, uppity minorities, my wife is editing this video, so she's going to get so upset with me saying this, is something that would plague the Austrians, and so naturally, the next step is to invalidate the Croatian constitution. In order to ensure our hold on the Croatian people, we must suspend the constitution which was granted to them in order to write a new one, more faithful to the national version. Yes. 1910 Hungarian parliamentary election. Unfortunately, a pro-independence movement called the F48P is well on its way to winning the vote. This absolutist entity has already won the elections in 1906, and a re-election could have very serious consequences for our nation. Oh, that's fun. Yeah, I take it back. We're not going to have the Croatian constitution invalidated. Instead, the big focus during this time is likely going to be specifically on Hungary. Yes, a crisis crosses the empire. The Hungarian parliament inflicts great pressure upon us, demanding a reform in the army in the favor of Hungary. They ask for a chain of command in Hungarian. This demand is supported by the 48 Coalition, a nationalist group. Opposed to such reform, Emperor Franz Joseph announced that if the Hungarians pursued their demands, he would abdicate and place Franz Ferdinand in his place. Franz Ferdinand is known to hate Hungarians, absolutely would not help the affairs of nationalists. Yeah, historically what ends up happening is that the 48 Coalition is forced to give up, which is something that greatly... Yeah, historically what happens is that the 48 Coalition, I guess, gives up. Historically what happens is that the 48 Coalition gives up. That with Franz Joseph refusing to give in, it is something that helps to destabilize parts of the empire and really does upset people in it. But we have to assume in this time that perhaps it's not as negative of an impact, I guess we could say, because theoretically, with greater military prowess, the army, which... yes, is going to be composed of many different nationalities, is something that is probably a little bit more united in this time than it is in our own. A little bit, we can say. It is still something that is going to negatively impact the state. Austria will still then go and pass the Act of Protection. The Protection Act is a bill intended to extend imperial military service over the long term. Although it does not concern the next levies, it demonstrates the capacity of the central power to impose its authority. It is during this time of, we should say, rapid political centralization, economic centralization, that the Austrian government, which is more powerful, again, in this time because of its greater economy, will attempt to exert more of its will upon the varying different minority groups. At the same time, in regards to the chief of army, the one who is going to take charge here is Blasius von Schumann, as we will assume that, again, with greater money, with greater industry, the Austrian military is able to reform itself to a much larger degree than it was in our own time. With that then, the next step is to support Hungarian industry. The support of Hungarian industry will allow us to increase our military capacity while innovating in the construction of armored trains resistant to bombardments. Yes, this is something that, despite not being able to do as much on the military side, Hungarian politicians will of course gladly welcome greater investment into Hungarian society, and by that I mean into their pockets. The Hungarian nobility that largely controlled Hungary during this time were not innocent, of course. We talk about this multiple times in history where, oh, the Hungarians were being oppressed by the Austrians. Well, yes, they were, but the Hungarians within Hungary, the nobility that worked with the Austrians, they notoriously bullied and oppressed the Croatians and other minority groups within their sphere of influence. Nobility is nobility, no matter what you want to call it. The other thing we have to understand, because we primarily talked about land warfare in the sense, is that the Austrians did actually put a decent amount of development into modernizing a fleet. In this time, with more money, this means that, yeah, they're not going to be able to do necessarily as much as the Germans, and obviously not as much as the British, but they will have more money to invest in an actual navy that theoretically would be able to exert quite a bit of influence in the Mediterranean. The big thing that they did, I think, before the war was they actually managed to build 3 battleships, which is something that is truly impressive, and in this time, they'll probably be able to build even more. Despite all these changes that we have made and further focuses on centralization, this doesn't necessarily mean that things are going to occur differently in this time. You're still going to have the crisis of Morocco that is going to take place. You're still going to have the Italian invasion of Libya. All that is still going to take place. And the Austrians aren't going to be interfering because even with the greater economy and perhaps ability to interfere, they're still going to be focusing largely internally on modernizing and developing their own forces, while at the same time prepping for any actions here in the Balkans, which that is where the core of Austrian focus is going to be developed, specifically because it's all in competition with the Russians. So it is then, my friends, in this new timeline in later 1911 that this is where we see some really major developments. Hungarian interests are going to be promoted. In order to guarantee Hungary's restricted support, or unrestricted support, we must reinforce them in their position as the leader of the empire. Their benefits and rights must remain unchanged and a status quo must prevail. This is done specifically because the Hungarians need to be mollified in order to be able to reform the army. The army in this time is going to have way more funding, way more developments, and more modernization efforts, which is great, but it is still going to need to be restructured, and theoretically it will require more restructuring in this time because a larger economy means, well, there's going to be more troops that have to be reformed. Arbeitskits, the witnessed strong social unrest in Austria-Hungary, especially in the manufacturing and mining industries. Workers went on strike to protest harsh working conditions, low wages, and health and safety hazards. The situation has become increasingly tense, with clashes between police and workers, as well as significant property damage in factories and businesses. In response to these events, the government decided to take measures to improve the working conditions of workers. A social reform was worked out, which culminated in the labor law. This labor law, which limits daily working time to 11 hours and sets standards for workplace safety and the protection of workers' death, is currently being discussed in the parliament. Yes, this is something that we will say is done. Especially you have to consider that if Austria-Hungary is way more industrialized, this means there's going to be a lot more workers and they're going to need to take care of it because they're not going to risk destabilizing the government. So it is here then, after promoting Hungarian interests, that, as I said, we can finally reinforce the Gimnisem army. The army's chain of command is sorely lacking communication with a static and poorly understood hierarchy of orders. We must simplify the transmission of orders from general to the soldier, which is going to at least help us a little bit in the whole multi-ethnic army issue, because right now that is absolutely crippling. From this, over the course of 1912, really heading through 1913, we will say, the Austrian army is going to drastically change. The artillery brigades are going to be organized, more financial support is going to be given to different military industries, ethnic battalions are going to be reinforced, yes, which is going to create some issues, but simultaneously, more of them are going to be able to be created, and likely the German ones are going to be even more supported, which is going to strengthen Austrian control. Frontline and backline troop coordination is poor, sometimes causing friendly fire or supporting strikes that are late or inaccurate. Yeah, because with the different groups speaking different languages, this is one of the key problems. The Austrian army was horribly organized and would oftentimes friendly fire itself because it got really confusing. So it is, as the Balkan War rages across, well, the Balkans, the Austrians gradually modernized themselves to the point that, potentially speaking, by early 1913, they are in a significantly better position. Yes, the entire country is not going to be mobilized, no, but it will be prepped specifically to do so. With trained corps of specialists designed for specific theaters within Austria, such as the mountains, having already been developed, which will be extremely useful in any coming conflict. From here, we know that everything is not going to be perfect, but there will be certain things that are done. Czech parliament authority is going to be limited, trade unions are going to be banned, there will be more focus that is placed on controlling parts of the empire that are bound to it economically. All these things are going to happen. With one of the primary things done in the beginning is pacifying Italian Tyrol. A strong Italian minority is established in the Austrian Tyrol. This local population refuses the authority of the crown. It's time to crush it. After this, limiting Czech parliament authority, because Bohemia has great autonomy, which allows it to establish its own local rules, sometimes contrary to federal directives. We must limit the authority of the Czech parliament and be stricter, and getting stricter conditions. And so it is, as the Second Balkan War comes to a close, that the stage is set for what is going to be a new World War I. Situation in northern Epirus. The situation in the Balkans is very difficult for the Ottomans. Serbia and Greece have liberated Albania and occupied the whole of this autonomous territory of the Sublime Porte. We must contain Greek expansionism in the region. The army of Athens has seized northern Epirus, a territory in which Albanians live. We should impose upon them the independence of this liberated region. Order the liberation of Epirus, otherwise it is war. From here, of course, begins a policy of anti-Serbianism. The Pig War was the culmination of the deterioration of relations between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Since it is no longer possible to get closer to them, we have to launch a demonization campaign against them. And naturally, of course, Greece would yield northern Epirus. Greece did not resist our pressure and withdrew its troops from northern Epirus. An independent local administration has been set up. From this, next step, integration of southern Croatia. The maritime part of Croatia is not yet integrated into the empire. It is time to finish the ongoing administrative reform. From here, as 1914 rolls around, and we can theoretically assume in this new time that, yes, the Austro-Hungarians, with their greater industrialization and army capabilities, control more of the Balkans, that they are able to exert more influence, and from this, potentially stop the terrorists from assassinating Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But really, where's the fun in that? They may be fighting to end Slavic opposition, but it's probably not going to happen. In Bosnia, small groups are actively fighting the regime and threatening the stability of Illyria. We need to increase the garrisons and provide police forces with the tools to hunt down Serbian-backed pro-independence criminals. Attempts to fight Bosnian terrorism will take place, but their success is, of course, less than guaranteed. The crisis of 1908 invariably destabilized the Balkans. Although we have annexed Bosnia, we remain incapable of control, despite the high autonomy granted to them. We must reinforce the police presence on Bosnian territory in order to avoid violent attacks or even more. Yeah, that's not going to happen. Naturally, the Bosnian Diet is going to be suspended because we are going to try to take control of it. The result of which is going to be less than happy feelings, we should say. Yes? Less than happy feelings. Franz Ferdinand is assassinated still. Franz Ferdinand, the esteemed Archduke of Austria-Est and Crown Prince of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, lies dead. His noble wife rests beside him. Franz Josef has lost another heir, and to the damned vile sons of bastards that are the Serbians. The Serbian government officially denies involvement with assassin Gavrilo Princip, blaming the Black Hand, although few believe a lack of government involvement. Some time after it became known who organized the attack, spontaneous riots against the Serbian population began in Sarajevo. The conflict between Serbia and Austria has now reached a boiling point. So begins a European crisis. World War I is fully set. Of course, the Austrians' plan was always to expand into the Balkans, and in this timeline with greater industrial capability, because remember, they're significantly more industrialized than the Russians at this point, the Austrians would have further reason to be more and more belligerent. With the successive defeats of the Ottoman Empire, a new door opened to the south for Austria-Hungary. In order to keep the local population safe, we should take control of Serbia and Montenegro, two historically hostile states. Alfred Riedel flees to Russia. Without explanation, Officer Alfred Riedel withdrew his post without informing his superiors. He and his family appeared to have left Austria for Russia. It seems obvious that Riedel was an agent of Russia itself. Oh, that's fun. Oh, that hurts me. Set a duration of 75 days for unveiled plans. Oh, God. So that guy apparently was actually our head of intelligence services here before. That really hurts. Yeah, that's still going to happen. Cat, what are you doing? My cat has come to say hello, everyone. Obligatory like for the kitty cat. Yes. Hello, Moonbeam. If the war goes south, I just need you to know, it's not my fault. Half my screen is currently being blocked. Serbia, of course, is naturally going to refuse Austrian demands. Even in a time in which Austria is significantly more economically and militarily powerful, the idea of Serbia accepting is unlikely. Now, they still might. This might be an interesting scenario of what would have happened if Serbia had accepted Austrian demands in the first place, but really, then would we really have a story? No, we really wouldn't. Serbia refuses, despite significant concessions. Serbia refused to comply fully with the ultimatum. Now only one thing is clear. War is inevitable. So begins the Great War, my friends. And here is something that you need to understand. Historically, at the beginning of the outbreak of the war, things went, horribly for Austria. For over the course of 1914 heading into 1915, they made some progress against Serbia, yes. However, largely, the entire operation was a failure, and I think of the detachments around what? The army was split in two, with the largest contingent heading north over here to defend against the border with Russia, while it is that a smaller force, but still very sizable, was sent against Serbia. I think the Serbian army was around 450,000, and by that I mean the army sent against Serbia, and among those numbers, half ended up being lost over the course of the campaign. Yeah. Unfortunately, Austria during this time was just very poor militarily. It didn't have enough equipment, it didn't have enough artillery, it didn't have enough hardly anything in this time. But if Austria-Hungary in this new time has as much industry as Germany, or I say we should not say as much, but has 70% of the industry that Germany did, then this means that we are talking about a force that is significantly more modernized, with more artillery pieces, more guns, more everything, and is thus, well, still fairly poorly led, but much more industrialized. As such, though some attacks will certainly be quite poor, others will likely succeed. All the other events as we know it in our time period are still going to end up taking place. War on the Eastern Front is going to prove to be absolutely brutal, the Germans are going to attack through Belgium, and the fighting is going to then prove to be absolutely horribly brutal. As war breaks out, a call for national mobilization takes place. The new conflict requires us to accelerate the restructuring of the army. We must combine this action with national propaganda, urging local ethnic groups to put their differences aside for the supreme good of the nation. Thanks to these advancements, even though losses would still be terrible in this new time, the Austrians would likely break through in multiple areas. Yes, tens of thousands would still die, but the Serbians would gradually become further and further spread thin. So it is then that potentially by late fall, maybe early winter, yes, the campaign is not going to be immediate. However, the Austrian army is going to be so much stronger, eventually Serbia is going to collapse. Now, this is not enough to stop the war, of course. The Russians are still going to try and break through in order to defend their ally, thinking this is something that is possible. However, the Austrian forces along the front are going to be in a significantly stronger position than they were in our own time. They're still going to be divided, yes, of course, naturally. However, they will have far, far, far more resources. As Austrian forces are able to be then redeployed north with significantly less casualties than there were in our own timeline, the Black Sea raid would still take place, which is something that would bring the Ottomans into the conflict. Except now, in this time, the Ottomans don't have to divert any forces necessarily to the east, or the west, which they didn't have to necessarily there. But even Bulgaria, when it eventually joins in on the conflict, is not going to have to go and invade Serbia. But the Ottomans joining in is going to divert many Russian resources here to the south, to the Caucasus. So it is here then, as 1914 begins to head into 1915, that this is where the front against the Russians is gradually built up and prepared. Eventually, as the conflict grows, Bulgaria is going to join in, and what we have to understand is that with significantly less, casualties down here in the Balkans, that means far less resources are wasted, which means the Bulgarians are in an even stronger position than they were in our own time. So it is then, my friends, that as the spring of 1915, this is where the true offensives begin. With significantly greater numbers, with significantly more equipment, more artillery, more everything, the Austrians launch a massive push to the north, breaking through the Russian lines. The Germans are then able to attack the weaker positions in the Russian north and make their way south, potentially leading to a massive encirclement as Poland, as the varying different Polish groups that were sponsored by the Germans and the Austrians then move in order to be able to launch resistance attacks. For the Entente, this would be absolutely terrifying. A thing that oftentimes surprises people, many don't realize, is that the Eastern Front was significantly more fluid than what you saw on the Western Front. Yes, trench warfare was still utilized, but in far more limited capacity than what it is that you saw in the West. As a result, a mass encirclement of this degree is something that is actually quite possible. And even as this happens, the Allied forces may try to bring in the Romanians to help, but who can really say whether or not this is something that would actually matter? Historically, though Romania did join, it was fairly quickly conquered. This time, with even greater numbers of forces, the Austrians would be able to move in rapidly. Brusilov offensive by the Russians, an absolute failure, even with the Italians joining in, which will divert some forces away from the Eastern Front. Simultaneously, with a significantly greater industrialized Austria, the Italians and Austrians, which are fairly closely matched at this time, are going to be hopelessly outclassed. As the news from the east grows more dire, the Entente would begin to panic. Russian Empire retreated from Poland under pressure from the German Empire. Despite the strong resistance from the Russian side and heavy fighting, the German army has managed to cross the Vistula River. Warsaw, under heavy bombardment and gunfire, finally surrendered to the ever-approaching German army, and Austrian. The Russians have employed scorched earth tactics to keep the Germans from supplying in local villages. The people of Russia find themselves questioning whether or not the Tsar could lead the country to victory, with such a large city falling to enemy forces. This defeat has provoked a series of anti-German pogroms in Russian cities and huge waves of deportation of Jews from the Pale of Settlement, as the Russian command feared that the Germans would try to use them in lands to agitate people who were dissatisfied with Tsarist Russian rule. Oh my god, that's 49. No. 49, 4, 12. That is like 70 divisions caught right here. What is that in the casualty side here? I'm genuinely just curious from a game perspective for how many that was. That was probably 1 million men right there. Oh, yeah, to Austria, 1.2 million men lost. Wow. Yes, eventually by the summer of 1915, Romania would completely collapse. This in turn would open up further potential fronts against the Russians, as you have to remember in this new time, Austria has significantly more manpower. Now, we're not going to say that they have millions more or anything like that. That would be kind of crazy. Instead, think hundreds of thousands. Hundreds of thousands when out of the total army, they had, what, in the end, like 3 million men deployed? So additional several 100,000 men, all of which are much better equipped in this new timeline, is going to be catastrophically effective, we will say. As the Austrian forces move eastwards, Ukrainian divisions, Polish divisions, all these different groups are brought into the fray. Despite the Russian sympathies of the Galician population, there are many Ukrainians loyal to us. The Ukrainian Sick League has assembled a division of various paramilitaries and scouting organizations. Their experience will prove to be useful. Salonika Oh, no, I forgot about that. Another radical change took place in the Balkans. The French plan to land their army divisions in Thessaloniki, Greece, which is still neutral in the tides of war, to support the Serbian war effort. That conquered... They should have never actually done this because the Thessaloniki front would have been absolutely crushed here before, or the Serbian front is gone. That shouldn't happen. From this, as the Austrians, even as competent as they were, or at least their military leaders were, they would learn the harsh realities of war, and after many hundreds of thousands of losses, would still manage to develop themselves. Against the threat of other major powers, we are even more united. We will protect the dual monarchy and the Ausgleich. Why did I say that? Eventually it is, through multiple breakthroughs, that there really would be little hope of actually holding the Austrians back. The September Revolution. The war has exacerbated internal issues within the Russian Empire, forcing Tsar Nikolai II Romanov to take extreme measures and abdicate the throne. This happening a whopping 2 years prior to what it normally would in our own timeline. And yeah, that is likely something that would take place. If the Russians are losing that badly, that horribly, considering how it is that they did in our own timeline, in the event that they are losing even worse, then yes, they're not going to be able to maintain any kind of political cohesion or authority. Still, as the Italians ramp up their attacks, they are likely to make some potential breakthroughs at a horrible bloody cost. And the Austrians, having expended much of their forces in order to be able to invade into the Russians, means that they will be forced to raise from extensive conscription to a service by requirement. This will exacerbate many tensions within the empire, but it will be a necessary step in order to be able to fuel war against the enemies. Now, that's not to say that the conflict is going to end quickly. No, the Russians are still going to continue to fight on, in this point likely heading into 1916. Moscow, the second capital of Russia, has fallen to Russia's adversaries. Bested by her rivals, Russia sees her glorious city collapse. Local resistance militias clash against the impending armies, but to no avail. Sectors of the city have been set aflame with blood and corpses clogging up the street. It was only a century ago the Russians lost their capital city to a foreign army, a true testament to how far Russia has fallen. In rapid order, the two capitals of the empire fall. For the first time in its entire history, Petersburg was captured by the enemies of Russia. The garrison of the city refused to capitulate, because of which the German army was bogged down in a bloody urban battle. The German headquarters decided to carry out shelling of strategic buildings, which damaged the historic city center. Russian garrisons still hold Kronstadt and even Peter and Paul Fortress, but the numerical superiority remains with the Germans, and the complete occupation of Petrograd is inevitable. So it begins then, my friends, a Bolshevik coup. Another uprising took place in Russia last night. The Bolsheviks took the offensive and seized the seat of the provisional government, the Winter Palace. This happening a full year before it would in our own timeline. Negotiations in Brest-Litovsk. Russia invited Germany to conclude a truce as it is no longer able to continue the war without an efficient army. In the coming days, the Russians will hold peace talks with the Germans in Brest-Litovsk in order to stop the bloodshed on the Eastern Front. Food protests in Hungary. Now, here's the thing, my friends. Despite all of the industrial developments and things that would take place within Austria-Hungary, food would still be a massive issue, because one of the big things that ended up happening in World War I is that the Germans and the Austrians were cut off from fertilizer resources, which drastically decreased agricultural output. In fact, if we're talking about things in a time period in which Austria is even more industrialized, then there is a chance, mind you, that more fertilizer is able to be produced, yes, but also that they're severely lacking in equipment and supplies due to the blockades. This is something that is going to have to rapidly be addressed. Eventually it is, though. By spring or summer of 1916, the war in the East is over. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Obviously, Russia emerged from the Great War as a loser. The Soviet government, together with the representatives of the provisional government, concluded a peace treaty with Germany. Under the terms of the agreement, Russia seized the territory of Poland and the Baltic states, and is also obliged to reduce its fleet and army. This is where a massive shift happens, because historically, even after this treaty, which occurs, of course, remember, in 1917, the big thing that ends up happening is that although the Italian front here, or the Alpine front, is able to be reinforced from the Austrian side, they didn't really have the manpower or the equipment or anything else, and then simultaneously had to deal with everything down in the south. In this new timeline, though, with significantly more manpower, more equipment, more industry, more everything, the Austrians will be in a much better position to attack Italy. As veterans from the Eastern Front arrive in the West, food protests would break out in Vienna. And, naturally, of course, this would have to be addressed. As these fresh veterans arrive in mass droves, plans of attack are drawn up and launched against the Italians, who would have been throwing themselves at the Austrian line for, at this point, many, many months. It would be reasonable to expect a series of breakthroughs to take place, particularly as, in this time, Austria is basically the equivalent of Germany. Yes, more incompetently led, but against the much less industrialized Italians, well, they're likely to see much greater success. As experienced Austrian mountaineer troops break in through into the valleys, the troops surrounded in the mountains are completely cut off from supply lines, allowing them to be gradually picked off one by one. As a result, Austrian forces reached the border with France, forcing the French and the British to have to send off hundreds of thousands of troops south away from the front lines in the north in order to be able to defend against any potential attacks. Of course, Franz Joseph I is still going to die, and Karl I, the Blessed, is going to take charge. Under his leadership, this is where Austria begins to modernize itself further. The Austro-Hungarian High Command is full of influential personalities with delusional ideas. The figurehead for this movement is obviously Konrad von Holzdorf. He and his followers must be withdrawn from service now. A fascinating thing to note here about this new time is that the Ottomans are going to, well, I mean, they survived pretty much to the end in our own timeline, but they are going to perform remarkably better as more British and French forces are forced to divert themselves, well, not divert themselves, but stop diverting themselves to these fronts in order to be able to maintain defenses against the Austrians, who are eventually likely to get all the way down south to seize Rome itself, until eventually Italy collapses. Through the seizure of more resources by conquest, it is very possible at this point that the Austrians would be able to mitigate famine efforts by seizing as many resources as they possibly can. With the collapse of Italy and the pillaging of resources, even as tensions get further and further heightened, it means that potentially, if they're able to hold on, the Austrians will be able to break through into France. Even as progress is made on the fronts and France begins to collapse internally, so too does the situation escalate within Austria itself. As riots break throughout the country, difficult rationing and large military losses have had a lasting impact on the economy and the morale of the population. In Czechia, the parliament announced discussion of an independence project. The same subject is being discussed in Zagreb, in the Slavic zone of the country. The situation is incredibly tense. The minorities have been comforted by Wilson's 14 points in their promise to obtain independence. Until eventually, by 1918, even as things collapse internally at home, France falls, and the Entente is forced to surrender. The Entente powers have lost control of their front lines and have requested an armistice from the Central Powers. It effectively means the Central Powers have proven victorious over the Entente. With so many lives lost and political chaos gripping many nations, the political geography of the globe will change. It marks the era of Germany's political golden age, as the nation proves to be the single most powerful country in the world, along with their allies. May the dead rest in peace, as millions suffered. So peace is created. Germany and the Central Powers are victorious. As the Russians still continue to descend into rapid civil war, Austria-Hungary in this new timeline would still likely collapse. From everything that we have seen, even with all the greater industrial capabilities, millions of men would still have been lost. And now in this time, the Austrians would have had to march through Italy, as well as France, continuing to try to break through mountain after mountain after mountain, which would have cost hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives. The result of which is that even with greater industry and the ability to actually break through, there is no way that the Austrian regime would actually be able to last. Its leadership initially had just been far too incompetent. I've done this in an alternate history here before, where Austria-Hungary actually performed significantly better if its leaders were not nearly as incompetent and had actually reformed themselves, which is something that could theoretically happen, But in this timeline, we've just given it greater industry, but without the ability to know how to actually properly use it. Yes, the Central Powers, by drastically increasing their economic capabilities and military capabilities, do win, but it's not a victory that is going to end cleanly. Austria would be forced to create autonomous regions, and from there, federalist reforms would be adopted. Farm crises would spread across the empire. Victor Emmanuel would be forced to abdicate the throne of Italy, eventually plunging Italy itself into civil war after its occupation. With the Copenhagen Convention, after the end of the Great War, military alliance weakened due to internal divisions. Most alliances have transformed into international treaties, which should reduce global tensions. At the end of the peace conference in Frankfurt, Germany and Britain decided to conclude a convention in neutral Denmark that would allow for the creation of a peacekeeping counterpart for disarmament and security in war-torn countries in order to keep fragile peace. Now, answer for the promised autonomies. From this, Austria breaks up into a series of different countries. It undertakes national reforms, and while this may preserve the stability of the empire temporarily, it is still something that eventually will break apart. Galicia and Ludmeria is likely to eventually unite with the Kingdom of Poland. Different Ukrainian elements are going to break off and join the Ukrainian state, and gradually, Austria's influence, even though economically significantly stronger, will be much greatly reduced. As the world breaks apart into revolution, we begin to see a world that much looks like Kaiser Redux for that mod, except one of the things that is likely to happen in this new time is that Austria, and in general the entire Balkan region, with much greater industrial capacity and resources, is likely to be a much more volatile powder keg for a future conflict. What that looks like? Well, who knows? With that, my friends, we're going to end things here today. This actually took way longer than I thought it would. I thought I'd be done in like 3 hours. This took me 5 or 6 hours to record. Oh, dear God. I appreciate all of you for watching. Thank you so very much for listening. I'll see you all here next time. Goodbye, my friends.